again, everyone. I hope everyone had a wonderful Easter weekend. It's time again for another weekly load recap. We had a follower ask us, what is the reason that we list and talk about deadhead and deadhead percentage? So before we get into the load recap for this last week, Jason's going to explain why we talk about deadhead and deadhead percent and how that impacts the loads that we take and the reasoning that we take loads. So before we get into the recap, we're gonna talk about that a little bit.
Hey everyone, wanted to try to give a quick explanation on how to calculate deadhead percentage and how it affects your deadhead rate. Right here you can see we got deadhead miles. You would divide that by your loaded miles. So if we had 100 miles deadhead to pick up 1,000 loaded mile load, you would and this is how you put it in your calculator. 100 divided by 1,000 would give you 0.10, or you drop the decimal or move the decimal over 2, and that gives you 10%. And here's another example. If you have the deadhead 637 miles for a 3,245 mile load, you'd put that in your calculator. 637 divided by 3245 gives you 0.1963 or 19%, or if you round up, you would get 20% deadhead. So I'm going to explain here how deadhead percentage affects your loaded miles. Say we have a load that's 1,000 miles, 1,000 loaded miles, and let's say your rate is $1.30. That would mean you would get $1,300 for the loaded miles on that run. But let's say you have to deadhead 100 miles to pick that load up. Now Panther, they pay us 21 cents a mile for deadhead, which basically just is the cost of fuel. So we would make $21 for deadheading 100 miles. So that would be a total of 1,100 total miles driven, and Panther would pay us a total of $13.21. So you take your $13.21 divided by your 1,100 miles, and that drops your rate down to $1.20 per mile. So you see how 10% deadhead drops your rate from $1.30 to $1.20. Now if you work for a company that doesn't pay deadhead, it would drop it even further down to $1.18 per mile. Then I got a 20% deadhead calculated here. So you got 1,000 loaded miles at your $1.30 a mile gives you your $1,300. Then 200 deadhead miles at 21 cents a mile gives you $42 for your deadhead. So total miles driven will be 1,200 total miles divided equals 1,342 is what we would make total on a load like this. So 1,342 divided by a total of 1,200 miles driven drops your rate per mile down to $1.11, or if you round up, $1.12 per mile. So it dropped from $1.30 to $1.11. Now if your company doesn't pay deadhead, this is what it would drop down to, $1.08 per mile. Now on 20% deadhead, you might want to request somewhere around 75 cents on the deadhead, maybe no lower than 50 cents. Now I'm going to show you 40% deadhead, and this gets pretty drastic here. 1,000 loaded miles at your $1.30 gives you your $1,300. 400 deadhead miles at your 21 cents is $84. So 1,400 miles total, you're getting paid $13.84. Now you divide that total pay by your total mileage, drops your $1.30 down to 98 cents a mile. And if you don't get paid on deadhead, it's 92 cents a mile. Anything over 40%, you always want to start negotiations out at $1.30 on the deadhead and maybe settle for no less than $1. So I hope this helps explain how much deadhead percent affects your original loaded rate per mile. Hope you all had a great holiday Easter weekend.
So hopefully that explanation helps you now to better understand how deadhead impacts your rate per mile and why you really need to consider that when accepting loads. So let's get into the recap for this last week. This last week was March 21st to March 28th. We did 4 loads this last week. Our total loaded miles were 3,212 miles. Our total deadhead miles were 651 miles, which made our total deadhead percent of the loaded miles 20%. So load number 1 we did was from Indiana to North Carolina. The loaded miles on this run was 777 miles. Our deadhead miles for the run were 444 miles. So quite a bit of deadhead on this run. That made our deadhead percent 57% of the loaded miles, which is quite a bit. So the deadhead rate per mile on that, we did negotiate a higher rate than what the regular rate for that loaded deadhead was for that load. Now the load itself, it was decent miles. It wasn't a bad amount of miles. It did have a lot of deadhead, but we did have a backup lined up right after we delivered that load that had almost no deadhead. So that's part of the reasoning we took that load, is they did have that backup getting right out. So even though it had a lot of deadhead, we had another load lined up. So that worked out well. So brings us to load number 2. Load number 2 was a load that went from North Carolina to PA. Loaded miles on this run was 594 miles. The deadhead miles was 9 miles, which made the deadhead percent 2%. And with that being such low deadhead, we just got the regular rate on the deadhead for this run. It was okay miles, almost no deadhead, like I said, and it was going to another great area that we would get something out right away. Load number 3 was a load that went from PA to Indiana. Loaded miles on this was 629 miles. The deadhead miles were 78 miles, which made the deadhead percent 12% of the loaded miles. And again, we just got the regular deadhead rate on those deadhead miles for this load. Again, another load, it was okay miles. We were hoping to get something else before the long holiday weekends. So we went in and took that because it was going to a good area and figured we would probably get at least one more load before the Easter weekend, because a lot of times freight, over holidays, a lot of times freight will slow down. So sometimes, when you're accepting loads right around the holidays, you want to be really vigilant of where those loads are going to kind of position yourself in a good area to either get something out of there before or after that holiday. So that was load number 3, which brings us to the last load of the week, load number 4. It was a load that went from Michigan to Texas. Loaded miles on this run was 1,212 miles. The deadhead miles on that was 120, which made that 10% deadhead of the loaded miles. And again, just the regular deadhead rate on this run. Really good miles, and it gave us that one more for the week before the long weekend. Going to Texas, to Houston, which isn't a bad area. Sometimes it's kind of hit or miss in Houston, but that was a load. It picked up on a Thursday and delivered Friday evening. So even though we figured we might be sitting over the weekend, it was okay, because our whole week last week, it turned out to be a really good week. So we didn't mind if we were going to have to sit those 2 days over the weekend. So let's recap the whole week again. We did a total of 4 loads. Loaded miles was 3,212 miles. Our deadhead miles were 651 miles. So that brought our week with loaded miles and deadhead miles right at almost 4,000 miles for the week. So not a bad week at all, considering right before a holiday, like I said. I hope Jason explaining that deadhead rate and percentage and things like that helped you too, if you didn't understand about the deadhead. So hope you all have a great week, and we'll we'll see you in our next video. As always, thank you for watching and subscribing. Bye-bye.